Hi guys, welcome to the Macros Bodybuilding and Powerlifting podcast. I'm here with Eric Helms from 3D Muscle Journey. Very happy to have him here today. And I'm sure if you know me, you know who Eric Helms is, you know 3D Muscle Journey. But I still want to introduce him in case we do have any stragglers who aren't completely sure and you have been living kind of in the middle of nowhere effectively. So, Eric Helms is a trainer. Has been a trainer, since early 2000s. So he's a coach, and now he's working for 3D Muscle Journey, who specialize in kind of high level and elite powerlifters and bodybuilders. So very knowledgeable in that area, and that's why we have these guys on the podcast. He's an athlete, so pro bodybuilder, and I'm hoping he's going to get on stage fairly soon. I'm expecting big things from Eric. It's been a long time since you've been on the stage. Powerlifter and Olympic lifting. And actually, just to go on a slight tangent, I really look up to Eric personally as a bodybuilder because I feel like there's similarities between mine and Eric's physique. And so I definitely look at areas of kind of Eric's bone structure and things like that. And it's nice to compare against someone who I feel is similar. So not that might be putting too little credit towards Eric's physique, because I don't think mine's amazing, but I'm getting there. So finally, also an educator. So got a BS in fitness and wellness, a second master's in sports nutrition, an MS in exercise science, and is currently doing your PhD in strength and conditioning. We've published articles in really credible sources and has taught undergrad and grads and talks internationally. So came over to the UK recently, and I got to meet him personally, which was amazing, at the Shredded by Science seminar, which was just out of this world. 2 days, amazing. And is the author of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. Well, co-author with Andrea and
Andy.
Forgetting the name. I should remember. It's 2 A's. It's easy. And I met Andy as well.
Yeah, you forgot your countryman. Come on, man. Yeah.
He's all the way in. He's all over the world, but Asia for the most part.
He's mostly in Japan, but he travels. That's for sure. Yeah, man. Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Great. Yeah, and hopefully I didn't kind of miss anything there. Is there anything you want to add? Olympic lifting as well, I should have said. You've been dabbling in Olympic lifting.
That's... yeah, with my hip impingement, which limits my ability to do it, and the fact that I'm just not good at it, it's I don't do that much, Mm-hmm. So I typically, when I talk to people and they ask me about my own personal athletic endeavors, I say I'm a bodybuilder, powerlifter, and I have occasionally pretended to be an Olympic lifter. So, but thank you. No, that's a very generous introduction, and I'm happy to be here. And I had the pleasure of meeting you along with a lot of other folks when we came over to the UK, and it was a great time.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I know everyone massively enjoyed that, and Luke Johnson of Shredded by Science throws kind of the best seminars, so I think that's the best one I've been to as well, that he's thrown. Just the organisation of it with all the presenters. You all guys had your individual topics. It was amazing, and anyone who missed out on it missed out on something really special. So if there's another one, they need to come to it because, you guys really rock it.
Yeah, Luke is the man. Big shout out to SBS, man. That's some great people.
Cool. So I just also wanted to note that I've actually been following 3DMJ and the guys since, I think it was like 2011. So it tremendously helped me as a bodybuilder because I really only saw it as kind of like strict, rigid meals, all of these things. And that was the biggest part for me was, as a bodybuilder, when you first get into it, you love the training. That's the easy part, kind of. You love that. And it becomes a harder part as you advance, but at the initial bit, you're not motivated for that. But the dieting side I found really hard. So finding kind of you guys spreading that nutrition information about flexible dieting, things like that, kind of completely changed the game for me. And I don't think I'd be here talking to you. I wouldn't be here talking to you right now if I hadn't found your information back then, because I wouldn't be in the sport myself right now because I didn't find it sustainable back then. So I just want to say a big thanks for that initially. And I guess that was through Matt Ogus, who you initially he helped you guys build a bit of a social following in a sense.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was funny. I still remember the initial phone call back in the day. We had a manageable enough number of clients to where every time we get an inquiry, we'd just give them a call on the phone, talk to them, and see if they're interested. We can't do that today, which is I guess a good problem to have. But I think I called him in probably the end of 2010, if I have my timeline right. chatted to him on the phone, and then I remember he'd given me one of his first updates, via email, and he was like, "Hey, do you mind if I use this also as my YouTube vlog?" And I was like, in my head, I was like, "What?"
What is this?
Yeah, I was like, "Yeah, whatever, man. Sure, kid." And then I started, I'd be looking at his videos, and it took me like a few weeks, but I looked down and I noticed there were, I mean, this is 2011, so YouTube wasn't as huge, but there were thousands of views on his video, and it's like, what is this? Anyway, towards the end, he was starting to get, he made some fantastic progress, and we decided to, he lived in the same city as I did, so it was very easy. We'd, get together and do a few Q&As in 2011, 2012, and even 2013 when I worked with him via distance. Well, it's always via distance, but I lived in New Zealand at that point. So he was he promoted the hell out of us, and also the Muscle and Strength Pyramids recently. And Matt's, I can't tell you how many people who've told me they found us through Matt Ogus. So it's awesome that he's such a visible figure, and I think he crosses a lot of demographics, and it's cool that he is able to expose people to a lot of good principles, and because I think some of the people who do like lifestyle marketing, they do it in a way that makes it all look like rainbows and gumdrops, and it's all about them. But I think he's always done it in a way to get people useful information if they want to seek that out, which I think is awesome. So big shout out to Matt Ogus if he's listening, and definitely it created like logistical problems for us with how much exposure we got. We had to create our Skype program. We had to start and then cancel a waiting list because it got too big. We had to figure out different ways of doing intakes. We had an admin assistant eventually. So it was, I think it gave us a big leap in exposure. And we've had that a few times since, with certain clients who happen to have a pretty substantial following, who do well under us and decide to spread the good word. So that's always greatly appreciated.
I mean, the fact is, you could have been, if you were an awful kind of coaching company, you were awful, you didn't know your stuff, then you wouldn't have kind of exposed like you did. Like Matt could have shared your stuff and it would have got kind of beaten down, or you'd hope it might have, because there is some bad information out there and there are some bad coaches that do get bigged up and spread. But yeah, it's definitely credit to you guys for continually staying on top of your game and providing. Now what I actually ended up doing is, no discredit to Ogus and his channel, but I kind of stopped watching that, and now it's your channel I watch, and that's the information I want as a coach and practitioner in the field that's more kind of useful for me. So it's him and Ian McCarthy, who has now come back on the scene, were the first two people who really influenced me in terms of kind of, because I was young at that stage and kind of YouTube was a great place for me, I thought, to get information. And now it has actually become like a useful resource, like your YouTube channel, which I would highly recommend to anyone watching. Great place to go and visit.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, it's cool to see how the landscape's changed over time, and there's a lot of options out there. Like you said, it's a double-edged sword. The internet always. There's a lot of crap. There's a lot of good, but hopefully people are developing the critical thinking to find the good stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
It's exploded. The fact there's so many online coaches now. Like when I remember watching the videos back then with Ogus and him talking about him having a coach, and I was, how is that even a thing? And I think you guys were some of the first who did it, and now there's loads. I mean, I've now got a career in it, which seems crazy to me, but yeah, it's amazing. So
yeah, I mean, I remember when we first were starting up in 2009, we would look around for, okay, what should we be charging? What's the industry standard? Like, what are other people doing? And we had two places to look: Dr. Joe and Lane, and that was it. People who were doing online coaching for natural bodybuilders. And now, well, I guess a good thing is, if you remember when I asked the audience when I was presenting in London, I was like, okay, how many people are coaches or want to be coaches and who want to work with competitive physique athletes? And I'm expecting 20 hands to go up, and there's 200-ish people in the room, and half the hands go up, and I was like, holy shit, so it's definitely changed a lot, which is cool.
And I guess even just on a slight tangent is that the Genie, I didn't see it exactly, but that app that you've been involved with, now there's apps that do an element of coaching as well, which is incredible. It's actually insane.
Yeah, so Avatar Nutrition, Lane started that up. I think was probably the first one on the scene that prescribes and changes macros. And yeah, we just myself, along with some of the folks from Citadel Nutrition, as well as a couple geniuses from Georgia Tech, Obi and Keith, developed an app that does a similar thing. It figures out what a good baseline macronutrient level is for your goals, and then adjusts from there. And I was motivated to get behind that because there are so many people who are out there calling themselves macro coaches. Which, when someone calls himself a macro coach, it makes me want to stab myself in the eye with a hot poker. Because those two words don't go to, unless you're actually sitting there talking to like a banana, like, all right, carbohydrate, you can do this. You're going to refuel this guy's glycogen. How do you feel about it? And when I peel you, do you want me to break you down the center, or So that's not coaching. That's spitting out something that a website can do. And while of course it is important to be able to give somebody useful nutrition education and recommendations, truly what we're doing is interacting with people and building relationships. So I think people need to get a little bit away from the idea that all a good coach does is give you a training split and 3 numbers, because that's should be a very minor part of your value.
Yeah, I mean, even I initially remember when I first started, and I was doing it just via email correspondence, and that wasn't even enough. I found you guys were doing the videos, and that initially made me change my way of coaching. That was a game changer, because they might have put in a certain number of macros, but in reality, they talked through the video and they're like, yeah, I kind of was accurate, but not really, and this happened. And yeah, the element of coaching online is you have to get that coaching element. The coaching element is, like you always talk about, it's not the numbers that are most important things. It isn't necessarily the science in that background. It's to be able to talk to people and understand them and talk them through the process and what is actually required of them.
Yeah, I remember in 2000, like I said, we used to do these phone calls with our initial clients, right? Or initial inquiries, rather. So I would say all the way through 2000, maybe mid-2012. Now, we kept doing it through 2011. That's when we basically stopped. But anyway, all the way through then, I always felt like I had to defend the fact that we were an online coaching service, that we had to emphasize the pros and cons. Like, hey, online, in-person's great, but you're limited to who's in your area. They may or may not be good. I get a lot, as an online coach, I get to see a lot more people from various backgrounds, And yeah, sure, we were missing all these human interaction things. But these days, I don't even have to explain myself or defend it, because with, Skype, video recordings, being able to easily send pictures back and forth, and just the things you can do with technology these days, if you're creative, it's there's so little you're missing out on.
Yeah.
And especially when you're working with a population like we do, that for the most part knows how to lift, and doesn't need that kind of in-person PT, instruction. I mean, sometimes it's a little less efficient to teach someone how to pose.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty minor con compared to the pros and cons list that I think were around in 2009, 2010.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you touched on a good point in that the online coaching isn't for new people. You don't really tend to get that sort of population necessarily inquiring so much as well. It's definitely for those who want that step above. So yeah, without getting too kind of off topic into that, but that was really fun. I did want to get into a question that I'm interested to hear what you're doing in terms of Christmas that's coming up. So in terms of your kind of training, your nutrition, is that changing at all according to Christmas? Are you going on a kind of a Christmas, a Massmas, or are you kind of taking time to relax and just let things go? I know you don't kind of religiously track your numbers anymore. You're kind of into the more intuitive style of eating. How's that going?
Oh, it goes well. So yeah, I look at my body weight, and then I make sure I get enough protein in, and then I basically just regulate how full I am at meals based on whether I'm gaining too fast, too slow. And during the holidays, so a beautiful thing about living in the Southern Hemisphere in New Zealand is that Christmas is typically when we're on the beach.
Yes.
So I know everyone in London right now is groaning and like, you son of a bitch. But it's beautiful out. We just had our first day on the beach, I want to say this weekend. Nice. With some friends. And I hope, burn the shit out of myself. One downside is we have like a 5-minute time to burn in New Zealand where there's no ozone. So it's not all fun in games. It's fun in games and skin cancer. But nonetheless, we really enjoy Christmas. We tend to spend it with friends here because our family isn't in this country. So we normally kind of do some kind of holiday excursion where we go to a cool beachy area in one of the islands or a certain part of New Zealand. And I try to get all my training in. Because I enjoy training. Like people. Yeah. When you go on holiday, you do things you like. So I normally try to get in training sessions. That may mean also like if we're going to a remote area, I'll cram a bunch of sessions in before and then after, or program myself so my deload falls on that day.
Cool.
And then I still just try to eat until I don't want to, or eating a little till I'm full if I'm having trouble gaining weight, or just holding back a little bit if I'm getting a little fluffy, and try to get my protein up. So it doesn't change a whole lot for me really, and I think that's one of the benefits to having gotten to the place of flexibility where I'm at, but where I can still do what I think is optimal for my goals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
no, I think that's an adult approach, a mature approach, and one that is kind of obviously informed, because I think a lot of people see Christmas as like a time to just either binge or they get anxious about it. Where in reality, what you've basically said is it's just another day, and it's just a time where it's kind of an excuse to be with family and friends and maybe relax a little bit more, but not a time that it's no different really to any other time. So, I'm glad you said that.
For some people, if they have been coming off a diet or from the middle of a diet, or if they are not, because I paint a nice, pretty picture, but the reality is that it took me 5 to 7 years of doing it differently to get to this point. So. When I like to throw this caveat in when I talk about it, like intuitive eating, as it may take years to get to that point. Hopefully less if you're doing it in kind of a structured way. But there have been years where I was restricted enough before Christmas to where Christmas was like, excuse to eat, and then, or I'm, dieting and I'm worried about it and I'm bringing a scale to Christmas dinner and trying to explain to my family why I'm not eating with them, and struggling to find an appropriate kind of level of balance for what I was doing at the time. So I can totally understand, and it's something we deal with clients all the time. But this is a good place to get to if you're deep in off season and over a year away from thinking about dieting. So like I am, but
I think even just the simplicity of if you are dieting or if you are kind of conscious about that sort of thing, treating it as a deload, maybe a period of time you can have a diet break, and periodizing those things in can be really helpful in those sort of situations. So on a related topic, what's your favorite? Actually, what do they eat in New Zealand? What's a Christmas dinner for a New Zealander? Well, that's probably not what you call you guys.
Well, I'm an American who's living in New Zealand, and one day we're working on our application for residency, and maybe one day we'll get dual citizenship. So maybe one day I'll be able to claim Kiwi officially. But I think for us, because we are always eating with our American friends, and it's actually kind of like a smorgasbord of cultures who are doing their PhDs or masters here. Yeah, we've got a couple, American couple who's our best friends here, and then a handful of people from the UK, Canada, of course Kiwis as well. And I think it's all pretty similar as far as what people do for Christmas. They still have like Christmas hams or big turkeys or chickens, and then kind of all the food you might expect. We typically do big potluck style thing, and and just eat and chill and hang and drink.
Nice. Yeah. And what's on your Christmas list this year? What's Santa? What have you asked for from Santa?
Yeah, so I'm gifts aren't like a thing that I don't know, man. I don't really focus much on that side of it. Normally what my wife and I do is we kind of go on some kind of mutual trip that's like a nice thing for ourselves. So we're going to try to do a little holiday trip for Christmas as a gift to ourselves.
You're so mature. You're definitely over 30. That's why you don't want to
exactly. Yeah, I'm 33. I've been married for 11 years, so we have the same bank account. Like getting gifts is so, I can see that it came out of the account. So it's I'm adulting. It's lame. I know.
You're full on adulting. No, I agree. Yeah. You do appreciate experiences and the like little holidays and things like that so much more. And Christmas. I was hoping you were going to come out with something hilarious that you just random present that you might want, but
I could lie. I mean, I can make a very, very convincing and funny lie if you'd like. So
you want like an ab trainer or something? That's what you want. That's the special gift.
yeah, I'm looking for the frog trainer. I don't know if you've seen that, where you get in the frog position and you have to push yourself up. I've heard it has really good muscle activation. That's the one.
Frog pumps, maybe. But
frog pump. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the juicy bit of this conversation I wanted to get into, well, it might be juicy, it might be completely dull, because you might tell me that nothing is going to change, but kind of any changes or additions, anything big, small, anything you've kind of in the last few years come across with your own experience with your clients and things like that, that you'd make to the Natural Bodybuilding recommendations paper you kind of published in 2014. Because I know you spoke, we said you spoke to Alan Aragon, and there was a supplement recommendation that he might include within there now.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So do you want to just keep it to the nutrition paper? Because we wrote the training and the nutrition one in two different journals.
Love to go over both. We can start with training. Or
start with training.
Or the
nutrition.
Let's go nutrition, because I started with supplementation. Okay. That was in the nutrition paper.
Cool. Yeah, I would say, there's been a real recent meta-analysis on beta-alanine that came out. And it basically, the old cutoff was like the 60 to 240 second effort.
Yeah.
And now it's showing that, 30 seconds and higher might be kind of where it's starting to give a admittedly small benefit. Mm-hmm. And when you think about the tempos most people lift with, we're talking about a rep lasting about 3 seconds on average, So maybe for high rep training, it also depends on the movement. Like obviously like a curl is not going to last 3 seconds, a full up and down on a squat might. So beta-alanine has definitely been something where I tend to not recommend it to powerlifters. Yeah. Of course, it's a bodybuilding paper, so it's a lot lower on my list. And what it's been climbing, as what you mentioned, Alan Aragon talked about I guess that was on my Instagram when I interviewed him while we were in.
Yeah.
I interviewed him while we were in Norway, and then put the full interview on our YouTube. He was talking about how citrulline malate is starting to show potential benefits for strength athletes, bodybuilders, and body recomp, and I would totally agree with that. So yeah, that would probably change in our supplement recommendations. I would say things are just as murky in the fields of meal timing and spacing. There's hits and misses and kind of the intermittent caloric restriction stuff. Mm-hmm. And no one has yet really done solid work on refeeds in the way that we do them in the physique community typically. Yeah. Which there's a lot of cool stuff to be done. So I still want to see people doing studies on 1 day, 2 day per week, 3 day per week refeeds instead of, like 5 days at maintenance, 2 days heavy dieting, kind of, which is all that's the closest out there. As far as nutrient timing, I think there's been more and more research in protein spread. Yeah. And admittedly, a lot of the same limitations are still there that we're looking at. Not a whole lot of other nutrients, short-term studies, and lack of realistic longitudinal training programs. But I would say that kind of the overall evidence probably points in the direction of you probably want to try to spread your protein feedings over at least 3 meals per day if you want to optimize things. And there's been some recent work where basically showing the interaction of training with nutrition. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing a full body workout versus an isolated muscle, there's a higher level of protein you can ingest, which will elevate muscle protein synthesis, which is not surprising. It seems intuitive. Yeah. I think people still need to think about their total protein intake per day and less about individual meals, in my opinion, and then figure out how to spread that out in order to get what's likely to be an optimal dose. There's also a lot more research going into the idea that has been around since the late 90s, if I recall correctly, of taking in a slow digesting protein source before bed to try to offset the potential catabolism there. And it makes sense mechanistically, just like all this stuff does. But until they do a protein matched resistance trained long-term study where they've got at least a couple months of people ingesting the same amount of protein but just timed differently, so some is over the overnight fast and they're training the same, are we going to really know if that is something the body can compensate for or not, or is it necessary or beneficial? But at the moment, I would say it's probably not a bad idea to get a slow digesting protein source before you go to bed. It's kind of one of those things where, is there a significant cost to your life stress? No, probably not. You're going to be home at 9, 10 p.m. most days anyway, so why not have, some meat or some dairy before you go to bed, that kind of thing. That might be something we'd include. So citrulline malate, a little more fleshing out of the protein dosing. Protein overall, that was my master's focus. I had a hypothesis that there would be stronger evidence than I found, in my opinion, for lean body mass retention during a diet. And while I think my systematic review showed that there were hintings in that direction, it was a very limited systematic review. And soon we're going to have more data, not necessarily in a dieted state, but I'm working on a meta-analysis along with Alan Aragon, Stu Phillips, Brad Schoenfeld, Menno Henselmans, and a bunch of people from Stu Phillips' lab who are doing the vast majority of the work, where we're trying to get kind of the dose response of protein as far as strength and muscle mass. I think we'll have a better idea of what's a reasonable intake there. And I think while we don't have the highest quality or strength of evidence to say, higher protein intakes will guard against lean body mass losses during a diet, anymore, that you'd need to take in more than when you're in a surplus or maintenance. I do think there's strong enough evidence to suggest that satiety and the basically sensation of wellness and sustainability of the diet might be higher with a higher protein intake, but not taking it so far that it's going to impinge on your fat and carbohydrate. And that's what I found in my master's study. And I would say there's a fair amount of evidence that also kind of agrees with that out there. So I think the protein recommendations would probably stay the same, but I would probably be less firm about the possibility of that actually helping with lean body mass retention directly through the mechanism proposed, but rather through making the diet more sustainable and leaving you feeling less stressed throughout the process, which I do think could have a measurable impact on lean body mass retention.
Cool. No, I think there's definitely been way more work coming out on, well, seemingly anyway, the MPS type studies, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of, it does bring it all back to kind of the old school, where it kind of, if it fits your macros came in, it was like, well, you just hit your macros by the end of the day, and that was kind of like the extreme away from what was initially the extreme of like eat every 2 to 3 hours or something, whereas now it's coming to the point of, okay, hitting your macros by the end of the day is most important, but if you can spread out your protein slightly better through the day, it's becoming more and more evident that that's probably going to provide some sort of benefit for you. But I remember in the paper you said it's probably more important for muscle growth than it is for muscle retention. Is that still the case, do you think?
I'm not sure. I think a better way to look at it is that whether you're in a surplus or a deficit, the kinetics are the same. Like, you get a strong muscle protein synthesis dose from taking protein in, and from resistance training, it can augment the protein response. There's still a refractory period, and between meals you are actually catabolizing proteins, and you're going into a net negative protein balance. And the height of those peaks and the depth of those valleys just change deficit compared to surplus. So it's, I'd like to get a little away from strictly saying retention during dieting and gaining during a surplus, because it gets people back into that mindset that, I cannot gain muscle while I'm dieting. When in reality, you're probably gaining small amounts while you have higher body fat levels and your deficit isn't large, and then it's much harder to do so, and you might be losing a little bit by the end, and the net change is a small loss of muscle over, like I say, a 6-month prep for most people. I don't think it changes either way. I think whatever would result in the best growth response would probably also result in the best muscle retention. There are some things your body does when you go into a deficit. It makes your utilization of protein more efficient, which is a great indicator of saying, hey, I'm at a risk of losing muscle mass, so I'm going to need to do more with what I have. I don't think it necessarily would change either way, in my opinion.
And have you ever, on a related note, with your clients, have you ever had someone go kind of really want to push their protein high and seen benefit from that, or even the other way, kind of bring it really low and actually retain muscle perfectly fine, and like you can give them more carbs and they can train better or something like that?
Yeah, I have. And, for the most part, within the ranges that we are comfortable with as bodybuilders, which is typically, like that 1.8 grams per kg up to, 3, slightly over 3 grams per kg, I don't see a whole heck of a lot of differences.
Mm-hmm.
And with the people who let me experiment and play around, some people feel better though, and I think there is something to that. And there's evidence behind that. Like Andrea will talk about how she feels better on a higher protein diet, and she has some physiological reasons that would probably underpin that. Yeah. And I've certainly seen that with other people too. I have seen, I think, guys who are older feeling better on higher protein diets, but that may be a consequence of therefore their carbohydrates might be a little lower, kind of thing. So yeah, it's tough to really pin down which macronutrient's doing what, because when you change one, it changes another. But yeah, no, there's certainly evidence, and I've experienced it anecdotally with my clients, that there's a big range of individual response out there with protein intake, and a lot of it is psychological and behavioral, but I think there's a fair amount of physiology at play there too, with age and certain other aspects of someone's body and clinical condition that can affect that, for sure.
And I guess that makes sense because the studies generally report the averages. So there's always people at either end of the scale who kind of fall off that bell curve. But yeah, I agree. I find having the higher protein, there's just something about it as a bodybuilder. It just feels better to have that. And I definitely feel fuller off it at least. So that helps adherence. So
yep.
Yeah, I don't nearly see people, especially people who are lighter, who probably don't even need as much necessarily. They tend to want to have kind of near the high end of the scale, even though they don't necessarily need it as such.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, we shouldn't be after what we need. We should be after what's optimal. It's just one of those things that I think, to put it in perspective, I think protein doesn't make that huge of a difference in the grand scheme of things. Especially when we start to quibble over moderate versus high intakes. Mm-hmm. You have to go really high before you start to cause issues with other nutrients, and it's typically only in a deficit where that's going to happen. Or it starts to cause problems where you just can't gain weight because you're so full all the time, and your TEF is actually high to the point where it actually make it harder to gain weight. If you look at some of Jose Antonio's work, I'd say it's pretty indicative of that happening right there. When you're up around the 4 grams per kg mark, or 2 grams per pound for the Americans listening, I mean that's a lot of protein. Mm-hmm. That's me consuming over 400 grams of protein a day. And that is hard to do practically and very filling. So yeah, it's I think it's filling to the point of potential detriment if you're someone who struggles to gain weight. And in a diet, you just can't do that because you wouldn't have anything to fuel your training, and you wouldn't have enough fat or carbohydrate in your diet. And I don't think it would be a useful strategy dieting to prevent yourself from being hungry. I think it would actually cause more problems if you were to try to go that high. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of math problem when you play with it. And for the most part, that's why I like to go with personal preference within the range of that kind of 1.8 to 2.8 grams per kg for the most part.
That makes sense. And then I wanted to talk about a little bit more, because I know your perspective on refeeds has slightly changed. And it's becoming more of a kind of maybe a psychological benefit more so than the physiological one. I know it kind of replenishes glycogen stores, which should help for better training, which would lead to better muscle retention and things like that. Have you ever had experiences where you find the refeed actually causes detriment? Maybe this person gets into a good groove of their diet, and so that the refeed actually disrupts it, and they end up being like, I'm just now like, I don't feel good and I find adherence harder. Do you always use kind of the same approach? Well, you never will always use the same approach. I know that question's a silly one, but do you have kind of experiences where people are really different? Do you have people who really can't do the refeeds?
Yeah, and it's typically because of the way they look at the refeeds. People who look at it as, I have targets, and they're different on my day that's refeed. It's 100 extra grams of carbs or 150 extra grams of carbs, do fine, and it's almost always a net positive. For people who they see the refeed as a free day or a cheat day, or as I don't need to weigh or track, or all the rules that we'd established as the way to follow the diet are out the window on that day. It ends up turning into a binge, and those are times, with those people, and that is a greater coaching issue. Then the issue is not just should I give them the refeed or not, but oh wow, I mean, what do you think is going to happen when the diet's over? Yeah. So that's something you've got to start working on behaviorally at that point immediately. So certainly the people who psychologically don't have the right perspective on a refeed, you would take it out while you work on that and get them to try to think differently about things, and kind of ask questions and dig deeper, and potentially even get intervention from a eating disorder specialist if every time a refeed occurs it turns into a binge. But yeah, the saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I really don't think we have adequate information on the type of refeeds we do. We've got a lot of short-term studies where you see that energy expenditure, by the ways we can measure it, doesn't increase. And it's like, well, I don't really think that's telling us anything. I would like to see two head-to-head 6-month diets with the same net deficit, but spread out differently in bodybuilders or just lean lifters. Maybe even the 8 to 12 week diet. That'd be great. And seeing if having refeeds does anything different, or even one where there is actually more calories in the refeed group. If some of the kind of the metabolic magic that happens with glycogen replenishment and then preferential fat loss afterwards, because I've personally have not experienced adding refeeds to clients and having it slow down their diet time when we're talking about a 24 or 48 hour. It's not like, I use a refeed approach and math says I have to diet for longer. Yeah. I mean, it does, but that's just not necessarily what happens. I find they retain a faster rate of weight loss throughout. Whether that's whooshes and water weight losses that prompt me to make less changes, to prompt them to have less issues, I don't know. But or better adherence in subtle ways. But regardless, I think the mechanisms are fun and dandy, but I would like to see some actual long-term dieting studies. And I think for women especially, I think refeeds are important. And I do think there's data to support that certain refeed structures would actually help them with their health throughout a diet, and by function of that, maintaining a higher TDEE, and even potentially lean body mass because of the effects of their hormonal status. So yeah, I'm definitely, when people go, refeeds are primarily psychologically, I normally don't just let that go, because I don't think I think it's a premature conclusion to make, to say that, especially when the primary mode of evidence we have is anecdotal in terms of long-term thing, and anecdotally, I've seen some amazing stuff with refeeds. It's probably overstating it. I've seen refeeds play a very important part of improving the results of someone's contest prep compared to not having them. So I'm not necessarily willing to concede that they don't do anything without the evidence to back that, and just an absence of evidence to say that they do. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And I guess that's actually a really good point that you made in terms of it clearing kind of the water weight in a sense, because your cortisol levels come down, and if people are really stressed out, I mean, I've had clients where we had refeeds and they're like, they haven't lost weight for the week and they want to drop the refeed. I'm like, no, that refeed's probably the one thing that's going to allow us to then drop that cortisol, and we'll see positive things come out of it. And actually the same thing kind of happens a lot of the time with diet breaks, which is kind of a week long maybe refeeding period. People will gain weight initially, but then it drops kind of all off, which is a really nice, and like you explained really well, is there's a lot of things interacting within the human body, and it's really hard to definitely know what's going on. So I think, you have to, that's why kind of having the online coaching and kind of all the data there, and you can talk to the person and look at all the data, you can kind of manipulate things to your own advantage there. And also on touching for the female perspective, which I found really interesting, I have a female client at the moment actually who she's small and has always struggled to lose fat, and when she initially came to me, we kind of built calories up, and she just seemingly wouldn't gain weight. Like, you'd give her more calories, and we tracked her steps as well. Her steps would go up. She was just kind of absorbing it all. But then whenever she'd cut down in the past, like she just said, she just stalled out. So we put in refeeds regularly, and just that seems to have kind of ticking her along. And I know some people can kind of be hyper responders to calories coming up, and some people are sloths, and they just kind of, when they get in a deficit, they just want to chill out, and their body doesn't want to change.
Yeah, very much so. Like there was a recent review paper that came out looking at the dynamics of what determines our total energy expenditure and how it's modified by exercise and diet. And the conclusion in it was that, overfeeding doesn't produce increases in energy expenditure. But I think if you look at the broadest sense of the literature, what we know is it's extremely variable. Mm-hmm. And this makes sense. Like, we're survival of the fittest. We have to be able to survive to pass on our genes to at least, sexual maturity, right? And to make it through ice ages and, food scarcity. It makes a lot of sense that preserving energy expenditure, or rather reducing energy expenditure in the face of not having food, is something that most people would have as an aspect of their physiology. However, the other way around, not so much. That's not something that would necessarily help you pass on your genes. So it does seem to be that there are some people who you overfeed, and like you said, their steps go up. By some mechanism, they are expending more energy, probably through NEAT. And potentially through exercise as well, that type of thing. And other people, this doesn't happen, So yeah, and I think that's something we've seen and puzzled over as coaches, of why some people I can just keep feeding them, and then it seems like you can do kind of metabolic building, quote unquote. Yeah. And then how quickly does it drop off, or what can I do to maintain it? Can I use more refeeds, diet breaks, etc. And yeah, so some people respond much better to that. And I think that probably colors some of my perception on refeeds, because I'm someone who responds very well to refeeds and diet breaks, mm-hmm. And building calories, that type of thing. But I've definitely worked with people who this doesn't seem to have much of an impact, and it's a much more minor aspect of the diet. But it still does have benefits for filling them out. You can get a better idea of what the peak week's going to be like, psychological break, and potentially just lean body mass retention. Mm-hmm. If you think about it. So the potential for benefit is individual for sure. I would agree with that. Yeah. And like you said, women, I think it makes a lot of sense to play with them doing it, because a good marker of how well you did with a female competitor, if they're a normally cycling person who's not using birth control, is how long do they keep their menstrual cycle? If you can stave off amenorrhea for longer, that is probably an indication that they are having overall better hormonal health, metabolic health along the way. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And I guess just from a female perspective, the fact that they are, Lyle McDonald's always talking about it in terms of how it is just so hard for females to lose fat, in that they're going to have that more dramatic response potentially just from that understanding. And so they would, just from that general theoretical point, do better from being refed, because it's kind of like, oh, okay, we don't need to starve now. We can kind of use some of this energy.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, women on average tend to come with more psychological baggage, because I think our society, it doesn't give as many messages to men, at least in Western culture, as it does to women about what the way they should look. Mm-hmm. And if you, like, another aspect of that nutrition paper we wrote on bodybuilding is there's a lot more women who come to the sport with a history or a background, body image and eating disorder, and men not as much, but certainly more than other sports for sure. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times when you're working with female competitors, not always, but you have to unpack some of that, and there are feelings associated with when can I cut calories, what does it mean to do so, increasing calories. And you have to overcome a lot of fear or even sometimes neuroses that come along with that type of thing. And it does change the game substantially. And a refeed having positive effects is a really good thing for a woman who struggles with that, or anyone who struggles with that, to see, oh, wow, I ate 1,000 calories more than my lowest day of the week today, and I only had positive effects from it. Yeah. That's a good thing, and you can start to work against some of those kind of fear-based behaviors and decisions that they've been struggling with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly had that with the female actually I was talking about before. We had a diet break and she hadn't really been looking at the scale but measuring it and reporting it to me, and then she looked at it and she was like, wow, how have I stayed the same weight when I've increased my eating by so much? It just amazed her, which it takes a while for people to trust the scale. It completely does. And for females who have those kind of views and they have it ingrained from media, so definitely. So actually, let's get on to the training stuff, because it sounded like you had some stuff to say on here as well, which I'm really interested to hear about. What elements of the training aspects would you have changed or may potentially just tweak?
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff with training, man. Like, I very lightly touched on auto-regulation in the training review. I mean, like super lightly, and that's just because I didn't feel like there was enough research out there. And now that I've really dug into that for my PhD, I feel like I could provide much more concrete guidelines with regards of how to use RPE,
Nice.
What you need to do before you're ready to use it, and how that can be implemented into a plan, and why it's worth it. You know, the issues with testing and percentage-based, like, do you really want to have your bodybuilder having to test 2 to 5 RM to get an accurate max on a bi-monthly basis, or rather every 2 months or so? And I think that's fine, but it does have to be worked in. It makes things more complex, and there are ways around that if you can get someone who is pretty accurate with gauging how far they are from failure, which we've got a fair amount of research on that suggests we can. And a new study just came out by Hackett, who did the original estimated repetitions to failure paper in 2012. And this is all based on Mike Tuchschere's stuff back from 2008. But the first instance in the literature where people were looking at can we gauge how far we are from failure was on bodybuilders in 2012 by Hackett and colleagues. And finding that it's actually more accurate than traditional RPE for resistance training. And now, most recently, 2016, they're finding that just in general, trained people are pretty accurate, and it depends on how far they get. Like in that 0 to 3 reps from failure, people are pretty good. So that's basically the 7 to 10 RPE range, which is where we're going to be working most of the time anyway for a bodybuilder. Maybe some 6s in there as well. So it's the kind of thing where now you can go, okay, we're pretty confident in accuracy, and from what we've seen, novices versus experienced are not quite as good. So, okay, if we can get you some familiarity with the scale, maybe use a traditional program first and have you recording RPEs as just kind of using it, looking at video of yourself, getting feedback from an experienced training partner to what they think, and then you start to really kind of ingrain, okay, I'm going to remove my ego from this, and really how far from failure am I truly? You can even do some AMRAPs to test it, or plus sets, that kind of thing, so you get a better feel of where failure is, which is why I think bodybuilders were pretty good at it in that 2012 study, is they tend to train to failure more often than other athletic groups. And then, okay, once I've established that, now we can get a prescription of load, maybe by percentage, but then let's say, for example, 85% of 1RM is supposed to be, say, your 5 or 6 rep max, right? And granted, if you've gotten stronger, depending on how your rate of progress from when you tested it last, it may or may not be. That's why you see studies sometimes where it's like people did 6 reps with their 90% of 1RM. It's like, well, no, it wasn't 90%. It's like, no, they got stronger, And that is kind of the issue. One of the issues with percentage 1RM based training is you can have a bad testing session. You can not predict accurately how quickly someone's going to progress. So that's the main thing I've seen in my studies, is that when using a percentage-based program versus an RPE-based program, you may ask some people to be progressing too fast or too slow. So if instead of just saying do 3x5 at 85% of 1RM, if you say start with 85% of 1RM, we have 3 sets, and we're supposed to fall between a 7 to 9 RPE. Yeah. All right. If you hit a 6 or a 6.5 or a 9.5 or a 10, here's the way you adjust your load. So for example, every half point above the RPE range, you drop the load by 2% on the next set. Every half point below, you increase it by 2%, that kind of thing. And that's an objective way to get you towards the stress per set that we're trying to get in that phase of periodization, which is, I think, really critical in contest prep when, as you know, your strength is a lot more variable than it is at other times, Other things I think I would emphasize would be that interaction between, frequency and volume. Now there's been a little more research on that. And when is there the point where extra frequency probably isn't going to help, and why is that? And I think we've got enough evidence now to suggest that basically the more volume at a higher intensity you're trying to do, the more rationale for splitting it up over more sessions there is. And instead of just kind of giving prescriptive values like you should train 2 to 3 times per week because I'm the 10th commandment bodybuilding guy. No, it's more of, okay, as you find your volume is needing to go higher in the off season and your intensity is, you're pushing it, for example, you may benefit from spreading that out over more days to help, with extra sleep cycles and meals between and time just to recover. And other ways of breaking up your training to reduce, things like delayed onset muscle soreness before you have a big training day. Basically fatigue management for the most part is something that I think I would probably change the wording and emphasize a little more as what frequency is beneficial for. Because I think a lot of people just think of high frequency training equals good because MPS, right? And that's just such a limited way of looking at it when you're juggling fatigue, muscle soreness, joint strains, things like that, and depending on the movement you're doing, and force production being compromised for a period of time, and then trying to figure out how to juggle all that. That's when I think frequency is your biggest tool to, manage your stress levels in training. And then a bigger picture would be actual, periodized approaches, which unfortunately there's so little on periodization for hypertrophy. And it may not even be really necessary in the same way it is for strength training. Mm-hmm. It may just be a matter of setting up an appropriate rate of progression and an appropriate frequency and and then that's it. But I do think, but if there is a benefit for hypertrophy of overreaching and tapering, which I don't think we've adequately assessed, or if there's a benefit of doing some of the same things that tends to increase strength over time, then I think there might be a rationale for it. But we're just not at a point really where we have a lot of longitudinal studies that are focused on maximizing hypertrophy to make statements about periodization. We know a lot about 6 to 16 week training studies, which unfortunately is a small part of an overall plan in the practical world where you're writing, blocks of training that sometimes last 12 weeks. And you're working with someone for a period of a whole prep or a 1.5 long off season, So I think that's where most of the changes in training would occur, would be kind of some of that nuanced aspects of how to, include things and regulate them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the auto-regulation aspect that's come out kind of the last few years has been an absolute, it's an absolute game changer in terms of how helping people program more appropriately, I think is probably a good way of saying it. And I've definitely found in my own programming for clients, it's allowed people to progress at their own sort of ability and rate, because I might have them down as maybe an intermediate or a novice, but if I actually just allow them to use an RPE and they can use it effectively, they can kind of go at their own speed, which is really a great thing because it allows people to go better. And I guess you can, and like you said, using the combination is really nice because you could always give them kind of a weight and a rep and then let them rate it, so you can then see if they're rating it lowly and you're like, right, we can actually build this faster. And I guess that's like the stepstone approach, and I think you took it through in the Shredded by Science seminar as well, the step kind of wise approach of integrating RPE style training, auto-regulation. I guess it's similar to like when you first start tracking macros, you have to be really kind of precise, and then you kind of allow yourself to do a meal plan, you switch meal plans, and then you kind of get free balling, and it becomes really effective. The only thing I think, I don't know if, I didn't use a lot of RPE training when I was in my contest prep, but I know times at which I felt so tired, and I don't know if I'd ever have used it as an excuse to be like, right, yeah, that felt like an RPE 9, I'm leaving it there, like, and I probably hit like maybe an RPE 7. And I think that coinciding with also videoing is really important, because I think people don't always perceive it accurately.
Yeah, I just talked about this in the podcast we had on 3DMJ with Mike Zerdos, but I was sharing how I like to have video, even for me sometimes, so I can get my RPE versus that person, so we can talk about the discrepancy. And you're right, things feel friggin' hard during certain aspects of contest prep. And I have seen and have experienced people who start rating their RPEs really high, and then when they send me the video, I'm kind of like, dude, like, I mean, I'm not too judgmental because I get it. I've been there. I know what it's like to feel like walking to the squat rack is hard, and then you're supposed to unrack 80% of your 1RM and do reps with it. Like, okay, so no, I think it's the reason why the RPE scale that Zerdos and I have introduced to the literature, along with his colleagues in his lab, it does a little bit better than the Borg RPE scale for resistance training is because it's a more objective scale. It's got very specific criteria for what it means. But it's an objective scale that is rated subjectively, right? So anything you can do to make you as the subjective rater more accurate is probably a good idea. So things like velocity measurements to go alongside of it, things like video, things like a coach are all very useful things to have. And yeah, so I think that is pretty important. And yeah, so I definitely recommend if you're going through prep and you want to use RPEs to help regulate your load, I would look at video. Because then you can start to see how that wasn't actually as slow as it felt like it should have been because it's so damn heavy, So yeah, it is more complex. And you had a great analogy there where just like you don't go, oh, you've never learned anything about nutrition? Sweet, here are your macros. You don't go, oh, you know very little about training except you used to do, chest, back, shoulders, arms, legs, then 2 days off and every 3 sets per exercise that was in the gym to failure, in the 8 to 12 range, like that is taking them from that to a, vastly different kind of full body 4 days per week RPE based program, which might be what you think is optimal on paper, but is actually completely outside of their experience doesn't go well, so yeah, you have to use a stepwise fashion to get someone towards where you want them to go, so they understand the process, buy into it, see the pieces, and can ask questions and moderate it at their own kind of emotional pace to accept big changes the way they've thought things are supposed to be done.
Because the whole point behind the autoregulation aspect is people want to provide enough stress on that specific day, so if they can't actually judge that, it's almost pointless for them to be doing it,
or even detrimental.
Yeah.
I would say there are probably some people who would do better with percentage 1RM if they really can't disconnect their ego, or if they're just shitty at rating RPEs. So that's one of those things. Research is tough. It always pits one against the other, and it's difficult to set up research designs where you're looking at individual response. You have to do like what's called a crossover, and crossovers are hard, man, because if you see someone did it, like for example, in my master's, the 2-week crossover, right? 2-week study, right? No. So it's 2 weeks and then a washout period to where they're not in a deficit of at least twice the length of the 2-week period. So it's 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then 2 weeks again to do the other one. And you have to randomize people to go. So I have to make my guys start on the moderate protein, half of them start on the high protein, and then they wash out and start again. And then you have to retain them during this washout period where you're not modifying their life, which is difficult. I had to basically go, all right, it's a minimum of 4 weeks, but if you can wash out longer, that's fine. So I had some people who I'm chasing up after 2 months to come back and be like, hey, can I please starve? Can I starve you again? And then trying to retain enough numbers to where you can still do the study. So, a 2-week study becomes an 8-week study. That kind of thing it's quite difficult. So getting individual responses is difficult. And then, okay, so I'm going to do a parallel groups study where I get 2 groups of 10, and maybe that's easier than getting 1 group of 10. I can have to go through it twice, just depending on what kind of subject pool you're working with. But then you have this impression that it's either A or B. So the study that I finished in Florida with Dr. Zerdos was an 8-week study on an RPE program versus a percentage 1RM based program. Everything else the same, and I'm still running stats and analyzing it. I'm not sure which one's going to come out on top, but if one does come out on top, people are going to take it as this is the end all be all versus, well, would it be even better to have RPE? Like, what if we start with the percentage to get you in the ballpark, and then RPE modifies it? That's what I do in my practice. Try to get the best of both worlds to help the person be a little more objective about their attempt selections. So yeah, it's a tough one, but I think Yeah, I think a coach probably will have better tools than a scientist for discerning which individual person will be better suited for RPE. And the person knows too,
Yeah.
you know? Once they start failing on RPE 8 sets, you go, okay, you know, we need to pull back here and try something else. So it's a tool you can easily learn that it may or may not be appropriate. So.
And I think you pulled out a nice point there as well about how hard some of this research is. And I know sometimes, I think even recently, Brad Schoenfeld people were like having a go at him, like saying this research is already telling us what we already know. And it's not really, it's just confirming things that we've thought about before. And in bodybuilding especially, there's so many old school things that were done. And some of them are coming out to be relatively handy or useful or even correct. And it is useful as a coach and someone in the field to look at kind of what people have done, what people have done well, why it's been well, and kind of match it up with the science, because experience and anecdote are powerful because you can't test for everything, and we're only just the stuff that you're doing with Mike and the stuff that Brad's doing now is just amazing, and it's helping us advance massively, but we're still going to be a bit behind the coaches potentially.
Yeah, and you have to ask the same question different ways multiple times because I saw that critique and it bugged me because people were like, "Oh, we already knew that, volume is the determinant, so 3x3 is less than 3x10." And well, I was like, well, actually, there's just been a recent debate, about is it the number of hard sets?
Yeah.
And there's because you would think, slower lifting movement with heavier weights, higher weight, lighter weight, earlier motor unit recruitment, you'd think that maybe a set of 5 would be equivalent to a set of 10. Maybe. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I buy that. And I would say this study tells us that at least, heavy sets of 2 to 4 are not equivalent to heavy sets of 8 to 12 in terms of the hypertrophic stimulus, and it may be something like total impulse per set, which is the area under the force curve, within limits, because obviously something is going to come into play with motor unit recruitment with very high loads and low loads and stuff like that. So we're still teasing that stuff out, Mm-hmm. Another example, and shout out to Ian McCarthy, as he was proposing the question about, is there any point to lifting heavy for bodybuilders? Oh, and I would say that that's a good question. Mm-hmm. I previously would have said, hey, if you gain strength faster with heavy loads, that will down the line help hypertrophy, and perhaps it gets motor units recruited at a more efficient manner than moderate loads. And those things, that's speculation, really, when you really look at it. We don't have a great way to actually look at motor unit recruitment. We know EMG amplitude, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the motor units are recruited, or there's less or more. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of debate about that, and there's a lot of practical evidence to show that at least in these 6 to 16 week studies in moderately trained individuals, that whether you're doing sets of 25 or sets of 8, you're probably going to get a similar response, but and that volume probably is a large component. So we actually just don't know the answer to a lot of these things. So I think people who poo-poo research, even when it's answering the same question again, are missing the point of we're trying to get to having a meta-analysis on everything, mm-hmm. And then tease out the mechanisms so that we can understand what we're actually programming for. So I think no, there's nothing wrong with doing studies that have already been done, especially when they find different results, because then you're like, well, shit, what does that mean? A big thing that I've shifted from as a practitioner and as a presenter when I educate other people is, if possible, I start with a meta-analysis. When I talk about programming, I normally lean on 6 or 7 meta-analyses versus like 30 studies, because you can find studies that seemingly contradict one another. Often they're subtly different, and that's actually, the difference is very important. Mm-hmm. Like there's this study by Mangine where they found sets of 5 actually beat out sets of 8 to 12. Then you look at the rest periods and you realize they're going to failure, and you start to realize that, oh wow, the load was actually going to have to drop a lot in all those 8 to 12 sets. While I think, if I remember correctly, the heavy load group had longer rest periods. They're able to maintain these sets of 5 at a high load, where if you're doing, a set of 12 to failure, you're going to have to drop the load substantially, mm-hmm. And you might end up be working in the 50% of 1RM to failure in an 8 to 12 rep range. And then are you actually getting enough time stimulating that muscle before it just can't contract anymore because of the acidic environment, and it can't buffer to get a stimulus, or are you just getting better muscular endurance, So, and people would go, oh, well, that's contrary findings to Schoenfeld's. I'm like, no, actually, Schoenfeld did a different study, So what is different that resulted in that? I think that's where I think people are missing the mark a little bit, is that one study can't answer the question, and we need to get towards having more data.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's why when we talked about modifications in terms of like supplementation, that's why citrulline malate's now being potentially included, because there's more studies now being on it, because there weren't very many, so you couldn't really back it before.
There was one, and it was a study where they did sets of failure on bench press with a 1-minute rest period. And it's kind of like, well, of course, it would help. Like, you're training like a dumbass. Like, so why I wouldn't have someone do like multiple sets and with only a minute rest period? That we already know that is inferior for hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So it can make a mistake not as bad. Like that was basically what we knew about citrulline malate before. Yeah. But now we've got studies with 2 and 3 minute rest periods, and people going to failure on, I think, on like chin ups and even in lower body exercises where you get more volume out of the citrulline malate group. So I think now there's there's much more stronger evidence, and that made me change my recommendations. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it should be.
You use the science to then guide the practice, I guess, and with all of this that we've talked about. So actually, I want to come up with. I've got 2 questions that I think would be really good that I'm really interested in, that I want to ask. And the first one is related to contest prep and everything. What have you found has been the biggest barrier to either yourself or your clients in general to getting to contest, like conditioned leanness? What do most people go through that you find that they have to? Is there a common thing that they have to get through? Is there just loads of different experiences?
There are some common things. I think psychologically, being able to get through that phase where you feel like you've gotten smaller and it's not worth getting on stage. You go through this period where you're like 7 or 8% body fat for males, where you're not quite shredded, but you're flat, but you're digging. So you're flat, you're stressed, you are not quite sane, you don't look your best, and you're not diced yet, to where it's like, you know what, is it even worth pushing another 8 weeks to get shredded when I know that I'm going to look like shit on stage? Mm-hmm. That's what's going on in your brain. It's not true. And I can't tell you how many times as a coach I'm like, okay, stop looking in the mirror and stop thinking. You need to just be a robot for 2 months for me, and I promise you're going to look good. That is a big one for guys, especially. For women, they more often will hit true stalls and have trouble, getting leaner, and if there's a high cost to it, and actually just getting shredded can be a problem because it might require a very long time of dieting. Yeah. It's actually a big ask for a woman who starts in reasonably good condition in the off season to get shredded in 6 months on average. And I just think that's even with a flexible, optimal, quote unquote, evidence-based diet. Dieting for 8 months is stressful. And I found, to kind of sideways answer the next question, is what's the biggest thing to help with these 2 issues that I see? Diet breaks, longer diets, and 48-hour refeeds have been the things that I've implemented, and we've implemented as 3DMJ in the last couple of years, that have been game changers and make that process better. And I think from a coach's perspective, getting someone a year plus before their comp, so you can make sure they're set up in the off season, they have the skills and the tools they need, like we talked about with, you wouldn't just throw someone new to nutrition and macros. And then you can game plan out a 6, 7, 8, 5 month, whatever's appropriate length diet for the person, including diet breaks and thinking about refeed schedules and rate of weight loss, so that you can not be playing catch up and get them there early, and then start feeding them up into the diet so they're not limping across the finish line is what really has been the answer to those issues. But those issues are always going to be there. There's no way around it. And then just adherence, It's funny, there's generally 2 types of bodybuilders. There's the bodybuilders who think they are more hardcore and never cheat on their diet, and they're actually just arrogant, and then have worse times in the off season, like me. So, or I used to, at least. Where like you'd never cheat on your diet. That's not an option, but you do other dumb things, right? Like you train too hard, do too much cardio, cut your calories too low, and then absolutely go lose your shit in the off season because you set up that pendulum to swing back so hard.
Yeah.
Or there's the people who do, the stress causes them to overeat or miss out on their diet or skip cardio sessions or skip a day in the gym. And I don't think one's better than the other, because at least one person, they don't let the stress keep mounting and mounting and digging that hole deeper. But it does express itself. And so long as they're honest, that's not a big deal. The problem is the person who skips out on their diet, hates themselves, and is not honest with their coach, and then you're scratching your head. So, they're both very common, believe it or not. Most bodybuilders want to be the person who never cheats, but like I said, it has its own host of problems. The stress comes out somewhere else. I think in both cases, these can be very, very useful tools. And the person who slips up in response to stress, they slip up less. They have a better ability to manage their stress. They don't have to diet as long. And for the person who is just ready to crush it and works too hard, you're always just basically holding them back a little bit, and not letting them, make it harder on themselves because they're working too hard and trying to inappropriately, bowl over every obstacle. They're the hashtag dominate everything, guys. You have to
outwork,
kind of hold back. Yeah, dominate, outwork. All those cliches. I speak from that experience. Yeah. So, yeah.
I can relate to the sticking to the diet no matter what, and my stress didn't come out with food probably, but it definitely I know it came out in other ways, and it just builds up, and it's not great at all. But socially, I don't think there's a way of dealing with it really, apart from, like you said, with the longer period of time. You can have more diet breaks, you have more refeeds, and these things people I think people underestimate how helpful they really are, because they make a world of difference. Just if you can plan like a diet break during your birthday or girlfriend's birthday for that week, make a big difference to stress.
Yeah, I mean, it might even keep you in, like you said, when we first started talking, you were like, I don't think I'd still be in the sport if I hadn't come across my information. Yeah, that's one thing is, let's say you can just tough it out and not do any of that shit and just crash diet yourself and, just through sheer will, not lose muscle and look good on stage. How long can you do that? I know some pretty hardcore bodybuilders with great willpowers who've done that for 5, 6, 7 seasons. They don't typically make it to year 10. They always find some, if they stay in the sport, they find some level of balance and sustainability. Yeah. Or they're very genetically gifted, so that even, they don't lose a lot of muscle. Losing fat's easy. They start relatively lean, so they can crush themselves for 20 weeks, and it's not a big deal, and compete even at that very high level on the pro stage. But if you're not someone with those gifts, and that mentality, then you need to find a different way, unless you want to burn out pretty quick. So.
Cool. So actually, on a related second question, and this is the last question I'll probably have, unless we get onto something else, is you talked about for the males particularly, the hardest point being at that kind of the 8% point where they're flat, they don't look particularly big, they're not ripped enough. Do you ever have people who lose a lot of muscle to get to that shredded condition? Because I think it was Peter Fischen who lost a ludicrous, it looked like a crazy amount. Not looked like, I didn't actually compare the photos, but on paper it sounded like a lot of muscle loss, and that kind of scared me a bit.
Yeah, it's funny. We have a handful of case studies now on drug-free natural bodybuilders, even at the pro level, that have gone through things. And for those who don't know, Chris Foz was the original, who you look at that, it's like, that's awesome. He dieted for 6 months. He only lost he got down to 5% or 4% body fat, and he only lost a couple kilos of lean body mass. It's probably intestinal mass and a little bit of bone tissue. No big deal, right? And then Pete's comes out, and he's something like 20%. Which actually is not bad. It's just that I think he's probably on the higher end of kind of the normal one standard deviation out kind of thing. But more importantly, you look at his pictures, he looks fantastic. Yeah. He doesn't look like he lost slews and slews of muscle mass. And I think that helps us realize that probably the norm is that in that digging phase, you lose a fair bit. Yeah. It's very common. And there are some people who you struggle to not see a very visible loss of lean body mass towards the end, or just this. what I think is them just flattening out so bad that you just can't get it back in time for the stage. Because I've definitely seen some people who I thought were people who'd lose a lot of muscle on that stage, and then if you get them ready early and give them a month coming into the show, they kind of get that aliveness back. Maybe it is regaining muscle tissue, for all I know. Maybe they just needed the calories to do it. But I think it's probably a combination of that and being able to get their glycogen stores to some kind of reasonable level. And your ability to store glycogen gets worse the longer you diet and the more you restrict carbs. The actual enzymes which synthesize glycogen and your storage. It's like, the analogy I like to use is if it's not just like having a half full gas tank. It's like you have a gas tank that literally expands based on the amount of gas you put it in to some degree. So if I'm saying gas for all the Americans, I should say petrol for all your listeners. So if you've got a tank that's only had half the amount of petrol it's used to, it shrinks a little bit, and then you just can't quite get full enough unless it starts to adapt to having a higher level of petrol in it. So that's another aspect of that. But definitely that is something you see, and it's good to be a little scared of contest prep. I think. I think I spend so much time talking about optimal approaches and flexible dieting, and how sometimes we set up these unfortunate dichotomies of bro and crash diets versus flexible diets, and they're so much better. But if people take away from that, if I take a flexible approach, it's going to be easy. They're missing the point, because if bodybuilding could be easy, we wouldn't study it this much and try to figure out the best way to do it. It's so damn hard that there are entire companies like Revive Stronger and 3DMJ that are trying to work towards making it more sustainable, because it's not, and no matter how well you do it, it's still one of the hardest things to do that you can do.
And I guess on a less, not a less negative note, more positive note, in that you were saying how some people build that muscle back up after the contest prep. Generally, you see the muscle come back. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, it's a temporary loss, and that's kind of key. Is so if you are someone who loses a shit ton of muscle when you diet, it just seems like nothing you do can get around it. So get ready 2 months early, and then slowly feed up into the show, and you'll probably find you have a much better outcome. I have found that myself. My 2009 season, I was able to eat up into my last show to my benefit, even only for like 3 weeks, but it made a big difference. And then 2011, I got in shape like a couple weeks before I did my shows, and I was quite a bit lighter in 2011 versus 2009. So it's one of those things where no such thing as peaking early, Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I guess when you say building back into the show, you just basically just eking up calories slightly to maintenance, and you're just trying to hold condition. It's kind of like a long extended peak week, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. So you're trying to reduce the size of the deficit to the point where you're not losing any weight, and if you've got a good eye, you can gain weight so long as you can see that there's no negative change to your physique. I think I'll use 2009 as an example. I want to say the lowest body weight I hit was like 181 point something, and then the last 3 weeks I was in like 185. So that's, whether it was muscle or not, it's 4 pounds of fullness. Water, glycogen, food in my gut, and at least the visible appearance of having more full muscle. So I think that did make a big difference as far as
No, that's really interesting.
Presented.
Wow. So I'm going to thank you. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to make sure everyone knows where to reach you. I'm going to put all of these links in the comments below, but if there's anywhere you think you particularly want to send people to, I know your website's getting redone because I saw that on Andrea's Snapchat, and or if you've got anything new coming out you want to kind of present to people. Are you updating the muscle and strength pyramid soon? I thought you said you may be doing something there.
Probably mid next year. So, okay. But the websites will stay the same. So we're getting a new 3D Muscle Journey website that is still, www.3dmusclejourney. The muscle and strength pyramids, we're going to release a second edition sometime mid to, third, fourth quarter next year. Cool. That's still muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. And then, our YouTube, my Instagram, whole nine.
Awesome. Yeah. And Eric's now regular on Instagram, which is really fun because the cool kids like me are on Instagram and we follow Eric. So I'll have all these links in the comments below, and I just want to thank Eric again for joining me here.
Honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
And everyone else, thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers, guys.